Greetings, 6th grade parents and students. Mr. Korn here. Today's video is about fractions, decimals, and percents. Every fraction has a decimal form, which can also be turned into a percent. And vice versa, every percent can be turned into a decimal, which can also be turned into a fraction. And this video is going to teach you how to convert between fractions to decimal form to percent form. Okay, so first, let's look at changing a fraction to a decimal. When you're given a fraction, you can change that fraction into a decimal. And you can also change that fraction into a percent. But the first step to changing a fraction into a percent is changing a fraction to a decimal. The rule towards changing a fraction into a decimal is simply to divide the numerator, which is the top of the fraction, by the denominator, which is the number on the bottom of the fraction. So let's suppose we have the fraction 3/8, 3/8. We simply take the numerator and divide by the denominator. What we get when we do that is we take 3 divided by 8, and what we get is 0.625. Technically, 3/8 and 0.625 have the same value. But this is just a decimal form of 3/8. Again, the same value, they're just different forms of the number. For another example, let's look at the fraction 2/4, which is an equal fraction to 1/2. So in order to change it into a decimal, simply divide the numerator by the denominator. The numerator is 2, the denominator is 4. Divide 2 divided by 4, and what you get is 0.5. Again, the same value, 2/4, has the same value as 0.5. However, this is just the decimal version of this number. Okay? Next, once you have a decimal, how do you change the decimal to a percent? So sometimes you'll just be given a decimal and be asked to change the decimal or whole number into a percent. But other times they'll give you a fraction and ask you to change that fraction into a percent, in which case you got to go through the step we just talked about and change a fraction to a decimal first, then change the decimal or whole number into a percent. And the rule to change a decimal or whole number to a percent is just to multiply the decimal by 100. And we use the number 100 because 100 is the key number in percent. In fact, the word percent just means per 100, part of 100. So what we do is we take this number here, the decimal form, 0.625, and multiply it by 100. And when we do, we get the number 62.5. And of course, since we're changing this decimal into a percent, don't forget to add the percent symbol. Okay? So 3/8 is equal to 0.625 in percent form is equal to 62.5%. Let's look at another example. Again, like last time, we started with the fraction 2/4. We did 2 divided by 4 and got this decimal, 0.5. So in order to change this into a percent, we simply multiply by 100. Okay? Take the decimal and multiply by 100. And when you do, you will get 50. And don't forget to add your percent sign. So 2/4 is the same as 0.5, which is the same as 50%. And of course, these are all equivalent to 1/2. Now, as you might have noticed, when we multiply a decimal by the value 100, what actually, one of the tricks we can use is that it actually moves the decimal point 2 spaces to the right. So instead of the decimal point being in front of the 6, when we multiply it by 100, it actually moves the decimal point 2 places to the right, and then add the percent sign, 62.5. And same here. The decimal begins here in front of the 5, and when we multiply by 100, and this works for any time you multiply any number by 100, just move the decimal 2 places to the right. Now in this number we have a space here, so when you have a space like that, add a 0. 50%. Alright? Moving along. Now this is something we talked about in the last video. Okay? How to make a percent into a fraction. In order to make the percent into a fraction, just make the percent the numerator and put 100 as the denominator. And then you may have to simplify your fraction. Okay? If you forget how to simplify a fraction, go back to one of the previous videos where we talked about simplifying fractions and using greatest common factor to simplify fractions. So let's look at this percent here. 60%. In order to change that into a fraction, just make it into a ratio or a fraction where 100 is our denominator. So 60% becomes 60 over 100. And then you could simplify this fraction. And if your student is a little unsure of how to simplify a fraction, for right now, this is an acceptable way to make this percent into a fraction. But if we do simplify it, it simplifies down to 6/10, which simplifies down into 2/5. I'm sorry, 3/5. Pardon me. And then, let's look at another example. 25%. Simply make the percent the numerator and put 100 as the denominator of the fraction, and simplify if necessary. So 25% simply becomes 25 over 100. And then you can simplify this to become 1 over 4, 1/4. So, once again, this is a perfectly acceptable, way to rewrite this percent as a fraction, but whenever we work with fractions, it is helpful to simplify. So again, go back to the previous video on simplifying fractions or research it online to better understand how to simplify a fraction. But for the main part, if you do the percent over 100, that'll be an appropriate fraction form of the percent. Okay, so now you know how to convert 3 ways from a fraction to a decimal, from a decimal, okay, again from a fraction to a decimal, from a decimal to a percent, and then from a percent to a fraction. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your day.